Hi, I'm Alistair, and I guess you know who I am. That's because you're good at recognising patterns. As you know, there are two distinct phases to machine learning: training and recognising. We learn a pattern, and at a later time we recognise it. We associate things we recognise with other things: feelings, places, conditions, benefits. Flag's a big plus. So this process is like Gene Roddenberry's infamous pattern buffer. You start in one place and end up in another.
Thank you. The end user's place normally concerns the recognising bit. You know, does Siri understand me? Does the immigration machine recognise me? Will this voice-controlled teleprompt follow my speech? Sorry, if it doesn't, I'll sit and read, I'm sorry. The recognition bit is technically quite easy, as you probably know. It's far less resourceful than the learning bit, but it's still not really good enough for critical situations.
Here is iPhone 10. Now, unlocking it is as easy as looking at it and swiping up. And, you know, let's try that again. Ho, ho, ho.
Thank heaven I didn't let anyone use the transporter before me. The training process is often invisible to the user. They don't see this. It usually involves providing sample, example after example of some condition or thing to hone a set of weight and thresholds in a neural network. I'm sure you're familiar with this type of thing in a simplistic sense. We take some labelled data, we use a set of libraries, you know, TensorFlow, Caffe, we define our model, and then we train our model. And then the trained model we can use in the recognition engine. I'm sure this all makes sense to you, yeah? Well, in theory, this is actually quite easy. Anyone can do it. However, training is usually constrained. It's constrained by the amount of resources we have to actually run the training of the model, and more often it's constrained by the actual amount of labelled data we have. You know, no matter what technique you use, you know, DNN, convolution, forward feeding, back propagation, dropouts, different topologies, rates, epoch layers, sizes, and so forth, often it comes down to the quality and size of your training data. The training set can be small, as with something like a fingerprint, or it can be huge, as with an image. But when it comes down to training the machine for the operating states of millions of appliances, we're at the huge end of the spectrum. We've been collecting high-resolution data from appliances in the field now, thousands of appliances in the field now, for about 10 years. So we've got quite a lot of insight of this type of data. I'm going to talk about this sort of data for the rest of this presentation. Even a specific appliance, and this is one model of a particular chiller. Just one model of a chiller can have lots of different states for a single condition, you know, depending on how it's installed, how it's used, what the settings are, what the age is, whether, you know, you name it, it will change the operating state, even when it's actually in a good condition. Training the net to reliably recognise the hundreds of states of millions of appliances is not a scalable exercise if it's to be worth more than it costs. Know what? We've found a way to normalise this training data, that is, take millions of appliances with hundreds of operating conditions and distill their signatures into a manageable set of patterns. Let's look at some specific examples to better understand the problem. This is a reasonably operating freezer, and so is this, and so is this. And as I already mentioned, any single one of these appliances can exhibit hundreds of patterns for a single condition. Let me explain what we're looking at here. Here we've got two sensors. The blue line shows the electricity consumption of the condenser in this particular freezer. The orange line shows the temperature tracking condenser operation. When the temperature hits the bottom set point, the condenser turns off. Now the temperature rises, and when it hits the top set point, the condenser turns on again, and so repeats the pattern. If you look carefully, you'll see another pattern here. You can see the defrost heater going every 4 hours. The other two appliances have similar patterns, just with different thermal properties, different defrost intervals, different set points. Imagine having to learn a different pattern for every appliance, for every state. As I said, it's just not scalable. So about 5 years ago, we were receiving several terabytes of this type of data and wondering how we were going to actually make any use of it. A bit like the IoT industry today. Lots of data looking for a problem. We tried various heuristics, of course. We tried gradient boosting, we tried linear regression, we tried cut and other data techniques. What we needed to do was classify all the patterns, which we still called a database because of Paramount's copyright, and assign them into a small set of conditions. That's basically it. So let's say we've got 3 conditions of something working, something that's going to need to have some maintenance done, something that needs maintenance now, but we've got all these states of the appliances in each set of those conditions. What we found is that most of the analytic techniques really only worked with predefined attributes. They require pre-knowledge. They assist in the visualization, but not the learning. These techniques have been used, of course, in business intelligence tools for a long time. I think that's why you find a lot of the nascent IoT industry describing BI as AI. So how did we go about learning millions of patterns? Well, without violating the prime directive and altering the development of this audience, I'm going to give you some clues. If you want to know the whole story, well, we all know how futile resistance can be. I hope some people like Star Trek in this audience, actually. It's completely lost. Typically, what people call predictive maintenance today are just alarms. High and low watermarks used in some way to flag an abnormal operating condition. This type of alert mechanism is very susceptible, of course, to real-world noise. The way something is used, prevailing conditions, and a million other external factors are just as likely to trip an alarm as the intended condition. Too many false alarms, as with wolf warnings and car alarms, and you tend to ignore them. Other alarms you miss at your peril. Besides, an alarm is an indication you've left it a bit too late. It's hardly predictive. What we do is we look for patterns. But first, you have to be able to see them. A lot of IoT data is at resolutions like this, which is fine if you're just looking for highs and lows. But if you want to actually see the pattern, you have to enhance the buffer, if you like, yeah? Change is fundamental to a pattern. The rate of change provides the most identifying feature in it. You need to measure rate of change. If you're not sampling at least twice as fast as the rate of change, you won't see it. Worse, you'll see aliases. But with enough resolution, you can measure rates of change. Rate of change is less susceptible to external noise. The second-order and third-order derivations are very predictable. It's not important that you understand the maths, as appreciate that change is much more predictable than anything staying the same. I think it's a universal rule of the universe. For example, a condenser might cool a space at 1 degree per minute. Even if the end and start temperatures are different, the rate gives us a lot of information about the condition of the heat pump. Highs and lows, of course, are affected by set points, use, prevailing conditions. But this derived metric helps isolate us from such noise. It's in these metrics we can find the most interesting patterns. Context is also important, of course. The relationship between sensors is more telling than any metric in isolation. Deriving rate of change with respect to, say, the compressor running is going to give us another level of isolation. This will mean that this becomes much more consistent amongst lots of that particular type of appliance but eliminates things like the weather and the loading and the installation. And of course, normalization is key to minimizing the number of patterns we end up having to categorize. So by cancelling out external factors like loading, installation, setting, use, weather, etc., we can isolate patterns consistent with condition. Does this make sense? I'll give you an example. The pattern I showed you from the freezer earlier on will actually share a second order pattern that's common amongst all of these freezers. See? It might look a bit confusing, but in fact the number of lines and the clustering is very indicative of condition. The AI can recognise these patterns in thousands of freezers, having only seen maybe a few hundred. Let me show you a freezer that will fail in the next few months. Here, the blue line of the compressor is running almost constantly. Yeah? The temperature is going down very slowly. This is indicative of a gas leak. There's something wrong with this device. But of course, the user would never know this because what he'd do is he'd probe the food in the morning and set points being reached, you see. So he wouldn't know anything's wrong. Of course, if he carried on leaving this thing like here, it wouldn't be very long before the condenser fails. It's not supposed to run permanently. But if we look at the second order pattern, we can see how different it is to the good freezer. So our machine can very quickly see that change in condition. Best of all, these patterns are common to thousands of freezers. That pattern there is very, very typical of any heat pump with that failure situation, irrespective of all of the other external factors I've mentioned. So the key factors that I've mentioned so far are resolution, condition isolation, and normalization. Do this, and the millions of patterns that I mentioned tend to collapse into a few hundred for any category of device. It's no matter how many variables you start with, you can do this classic data reduction. Teach a neural net these relatively few patterns, and you get a, how did it do that moment? You know, when the machine can actually see patterns that you can't. It was at this point that we discovered something. When able to look past the data, we realized that we actually were only interested in the changes and the order in which they occur. That is, the patterns within the patterns. When monitoring something, you're not really interested in how it works, only when it's about to stop working. Without knowing it, we'd solved a problem by letting the AI show us change after change of condition. All we had to do was identify the conditions which we knew were preludes to failure, and we had a type of a long-range sensor. You know, it's a bit like you see a darkening cloud, and you know it's going to rain. You see an unknown character on an away mission, and you know what's going to happen. Let me show you our AI analysing a chiller over 12 months to give you an example. So this is one chiller over 1 year. At the beginning of the year, I'll start in October 1, what's happening is the AI is predicting with over 90% confidence, it's seeing good patterns. Things are cool. And if we look actually at the pattern, which we wouldn't normally do, we can actually see, yeah, we agree. You know, the temperature is actually acting in synchronization with the condenser operation. The temperature's cool. It looks pretty good. Let's look at the second order pattern. Well, I think we've seen this before. If you remember the freezers I showed you, there's a lot of correlation between the freezer second order pattern and the chiller's second order pattern. They're both base heat pumps. So we expect this type of thing. But see, that's how the AI can actually, maybe never having seen this chiller, immediately see that pattern to be good. Now, what's interesting is come January, which is an unusual time for a chiller to show a problem, is that the AI recognised something had changed. It saw a different pattern. And if we actually look at the raw data, we can see, in fact, actually, you know, the condenser's now got a constant base load of around 1200 watts. And that probably means that the defrost heater has been permanently stuck on. Now, again, from the user perspective, there's nothing wrong. I mean, the actual condenser's going on and off with the temperature's cool. So this looks good. But if you look at the second order pattern, it was easy for the AI to see the change in condition. You see, between that and that, it was very obvious to see the difference. Now, come May, which is when a lot of chillers and freezers and AC units fail, of course, the thing saw another set of conditions. It's probably about 80% of the time it's saying, I'm seeing this new condition. And if we look at the actual raw data, you can see, yeah, sure, this is not looking good. You know, the compressor's running pretty much permanently apart from defrost. The temperature's all over the place. But it's the second order pattern which is the most identifying. You've probably seen this, or you should have seen this before. This was very, very similar to the pattern I showed you from the 40 freezer. You remember? So, again, we've managed to actually take two different devices that do quite different things in many cases, but actually are heat pumps, and seen the correlation between the two. So that's how it basically works. It goes through looking at data coming in, and actually classifies it into conditions, and then tells us when the conditions are the conditions that we know are prelude to failures. So in this case, you can see in January, which is good, but 8 months before, and this thing still hasn't failed, it's still running, 8 months before the fridge was going to fail, we could actually tell them. And that's very useful, the case of a chiller, because we're actually telling them in January, and this is normally when most refrigeration engineers are sitting idle. There's nothing going on. So this is very handy. So why is this important in some details? Well, I'm going to come now more onto the practical application of this particular data. We've been doing maintenance. The type of maintenance that we're all familiar with hasn't really changed in hundreds of years. I've got a film here, a short film clip, which I'm going to show you, which is about 50 years old. But actually, this is just how it's done today.
When was the last time you adjusted the speed on this? What? The manual. It's the book that tells you how to use this without damaging it beyond repair.
Oh, yes. Well, I think it's, no, it was, I think it's,
So, while you're looking for the manual, so as not to waste anyone's time, what exactly happened?
oh, well, it just started to make a noise.
You don't think to lift the cow in? What sort of noise?
Oh, peculiar noise.
I don't want to seem morbidly curious, but what sort of peculiar noise?
Oh, well, a sort of scraping.
What, a grating, or a crunching, or a high-pitched squeaking, or a harsh metallic scratching, or a hollow, full-throated humming, or a dry, reedy, sputtering falsetto squealing, or a plangent, stridulous, crescendoing rasp, or a sibilant, twangy, clamorous, droning countertenor snorting, or...
It was a sort of harsh metallic sound.
What, steady, or pulsating, or measured, or intermittent, or seasonal, or cyclical, or rhythmic?
It was pulsating.
Evenly, or
Really?
staccato?
No, not staccato.
Loud?
Barely.
So it was a fairly loud, evenly pulsating, harsh, metallic, glissandoing, scratchy sort of peculiar noise.
Yes.
Right.
Does that mean anything in particular?
Of course not. Could be anything.
And that's how maintenance is done today. That's what you do. You wait for something to break, you try to get someone to come and fix it, and hopefully they'll fix it without breaking anything else. Some folk are more pessimistic. They do plan ahead. They get a technician to check the thing out maybe periodically. Unfortunately, it falls to chance whether this yields any benefit. 80% of walk-in preventative maintenance discovers nothing. And in the 20% of the cases where the technician actually does do some remedial action, 30% of the time he actually breaks something. So it's pretty undirected. And the reason is, the technicians are working blind. That's what the hidden gremlin is supposed to represent here. Lack of time and available data leaves a plethora of hidden problems. Technicians don't have the insight. The things that I've shown you, they don't know. And they wouldn't know what it's supposed to look like anyway. So, we live with a huge percentage of our appliances operating at subpar performance. That wastes energy, shortens product life, and increases cost of ownership. It also means manufacturers are developing their products blind. They don't know how they're supposed to operate and how they actually fail. They have labs and often extensive field operations, but that's just a subset of the situations while the product's still new. As I've already explained, almost every product runs with a different set of states. So they have a very occluded view of the real world. Being able to reliably identify relevant change and recognising it as a prelude to failure enables you to take action before mounds of energy is wasted, the user's inconvenienced with a breakdown, or the appliance is irreparably damaged. The maintenance operator can also benefit. He can plan repairs around a specific location, he can make sure he's got the right parts on hand, and of course he can spread his work out across the year, as I mentioned. So what we're enabling is a change at a fundamental level. And of course, any change is often fiercely resisted. Even if it's a change for the better, you've got a lot of other issues you've got to consider. So let me just mention some of those. I mean, we have the ethical issue to start with. You know, how much should we share? I mean, it's one thing for me to share a racing tip, but is it reasonable to expect McDonald's to share their training data with Burger King? The type of data we're collecting, you know, could be used for many things. You know, what about procurement? You know, is it okay for me to use this data to say this is the best freezer and tell everyone this is the best freezer? You know, maybe McDonald's doesn't want Burger King to know that they're using more efficient freezers. And even worse, operational practices. You can train the AI to spot different operational situations. We focus, as I say, purely upon looking for the maintenance conditions, but we can just as easily see the product abuse. We can train the AI to say this is abuse and flag that abuse. Do we want to be able to actually share that information? And here's another objection. Maintenance companies don't like cheap repairs. You know, they're very happy to attend the major failures. They'd far more rather replace that broken compressor than actually go and clean the actual cooling block. You know, there's far more margin in replacing large value items. Likewise, manufacturers are not concerned if you have to replace the product every 5 years, surprisingly. Our attempts to get some manufacturers to embed this type of sensor technology in their products have met with very confused looks. You know, what's in it for us? And then there's one final other thing I'd like to actually mention, and that regards the confidence we attach to this technology. You're probably going to hear some amazing claims about ML during this conference, such as it being some form of artificial intelligence. Well, without wanting to appear a cynic and confining myself to recognising, there are no 100% here, you understand. I think when you saw the machine, we're talking percentages always, no 100%. You can never be 100% sure. And accepting that something is at 100% is important when you apply this technology. I mean, for example, would it be acceptable for NOWAT to assert that we can always forecast the problem with a heart-lung machine? You know, say to the hospital, don't bother maintaining it, we'll tell you when there's going to be a problem. Well, it's probably a bit risky, yeah? In our business, actually, it's often the other way around. If we send a technician out to something that's not about to fail, the operator's furious. He deems our whole technology profligate at best. So, you know, it's where do you actually draw the risk lines on these particular things? Now, in our technology, it's not too much of a problem, but as you can imagine in many other applications of ML, you know, it becomes far more confrontational. Anyway, thank you very much for listening now. I've condensed that as much as I dare without getting horribly technical, but I'm willing to actually show you this working if we can't actually find any questions. So are there any things that I can explain better that I talked over too quickly there? Gosh, you're very quiet. Okay, you've asked for it. I'm going to actually run this live in a theatre, which is probably bound to fail. I think a lot of your software developers, yeah? So you know what it's like when you actually try to run live software in front of people. What I'll do is I'll run it in a browser. There's a browser. It's very big, isn't it? Make it a bit smaller. And what I've got here is I've got a number of pubs. We monitor loads of pubs and fast food restaurants, and we put the sensors in these places. So I'll try and find the one here, which actually I showed you before, and we'll get it actually to do it online. So here's the chiller, the walk-in fridge, and here's the temperature. So I'm going to take these two sensors, and these are the two sensors that we train the model to actually look at. I'm going to set the period. I think we looked at it over a year. So I'll set it over that year. I think it was October 15. Now, of course, we never normally do this. You know, this is a background task that, you know, the report generators run. Just for a bit of fun, I'll get it to try and do this. Okay, so I've set that. Now, if I look at the actual output of this, it should be, as we speak, analysing the data over that period to see what it can make of it. And there you can see at this stage, it's saying the patterns from the appliance, it reckons are pretty good. Yeah? This is what I screen grabbed earlier on. Here the AI saw a change in the pattern, and it's predicting this. So if we ran the report at the end of January, we'd see that there was a fairly 90% chance that we were looking at a failure in progress. You know, this thing could fail in the next 8 months. These things, by the way, carry on for years in incorrect configurations and incorrect operations. In fact, when we tend to go into a new client and flood their premises with sensors, generally the heat pumps, things like the AC, the refrigeration, something like 40 to 50% of it has got some fault in it. And that means if we want to put it into raw money, just purely in terms of energy wastage, they're using about 30% more energy in heat pumps than they need to be. So you can actually justify this technology simply in the energy saving. Anyway, as you can see, as we got into the summer, it noted that another condition had come up and that the thing was going to fail. I don't believe it's actually worked, so there we go. This technology is pretty robust, and you can imagine it's pretty robust because we've normalised the data into a reasonable set of things. So we can take a category of devices like heat pumps, which includes AC, freezers, chillers and so forth, and we can run pretty much the same model on that. And then we might run a different model on motors, we might run a different model on pumps, we might run, but basically it's quite easy to get this level of repeatability.